everybody. Thanks for tuning in and watching my video on my best photos of 2022. So I'd like to spend a little time to reflect on the photos I published this year and talk about the stories and how I took them, the mistakes I made. So the first photo up is from a summer trip I took to Europe with my wife. I was inspired to photograph the Pantheon after seeing an incredible composition by Joel, an award-winning photographer and the creator of the Artisan Black and White Pro panel in Photoshop. Now, Rome is known to have a lot of pickpockets that work on the tourists. So on this trip to Rome, I did not use a tripod. Typically, if you're photographing places with tourists or any cityscape, an architecture shot, and you want to remove the people from the photograph, the typical technique is using a 10-stop neutral density filter to create an exposure of half a minute to several minutes long. And in that time, usually people keep moving through the frame, and when they do this, they blur out and they don't show up in the final exposure. But on this trip to Rome, I did not want to use my tripod and get distracted and potentially be the victim of a pickpocket. So I did not take out my tripod. I left my tripod in the hotel room while I was photographing Rome. Because I wasn't using my tripod, I could not take long exposures. Instead, I would take many individual frames at the normal exposure rate that are sharp. I ended up taking a series of 40 photographs, and then in post-processing, I aligned them with Photoshop and stacked them. And in that process, I averaged out the frames, and the tourists that were in the photo would blur out. What I really like about this photograph are all the columns and the subtle soft light as it falls off, giving you this sense of depth of all the columns, and then the bright triangle at the top of the Pantheon, and you can clearly read the inscription. I also really like the little puffy white clouds that are barely visible above the building. Now, the sky looks especially dark, and that's because I used, for this shot, I was using a infrared filter of 720 nanometers. And so by doing that, it rejects most of the blue light and produces a dark sky. Next, I wanted to go inside the Pantheon because I knew this dome is especially well known and quite beautiful. I really like geometry and the way that the light plays with these squares that are embedded in the dome. So I got in line, and again, not using a tripod, I set up my camera to take a set of bracketed shots. So it would take a normal exposure and then underexpose a shot for the highlights, and then an overexposure to capture shadow detail. And I set up my shutter to take in a burst mode. So with one press of the shutter, I would take these 3 bracketed shots in quick succession, so that because I'm handheld, aligning them in Photoshop to create a high dynamic range image would be much easier. So with this setup, I spent some time inside the dome and got various shots. So here's a photo of taking 3 images, vertical panorama, where I held my camera in portrait mode and took 3 shots horizontally and stitched them together in Photoshop. Now in this photo, there's bright sunlight shining in through that oculus, that's the hole in the top. So that bright sunlight is shining in, hitting the dome behind me, and that creates a bunch of soft light in the rest of the dome, and so here's that image. Then I went to the other side of the dome, and we can see that bright sunlight shining in. And again, this is another portrait panorama, 3 shots blended together, 3 shots stitched together. This next image is another stack of frames where I tried to create the light coming from the oculus at the diagonal and tried to mostly fill the frame with the dome. And finally, this last composition I had seen in other photographers' images, but I really liked it, and I was able to get a similar composition here. I really liked the bright sunlight shining through. We can see the pattern in the dome and the blue columns. Here, the blue light is from light coming in from outside the front doorway that was open. So it's mostly cool tones reflecting off the floor. After getting home and doing some post-processing with a set of images, I came across another composition or crop of the dome that I really liked. So I went through, I had plenty of images, so I found a similar image and cropped it, and that is this image. The next image I want to show you is from Joshua Tree National Park. The first time I visited this park, I hiked a trail called Hidden Valley, and it was unbelievably beautiful. If you've never been to Joshua Tree, you don't know what you're missing out on. It is an incredible landscape of old granite boulders exposed from weathering in a desert landscape. And I didn't have much expectation when we went out and visited this desert park, but it blew me away. The day I visited was all blue sky, and so I didn't really come with great photos the first time because it's just blue sky and all these abstract rocks. It can be very intimidating. It's probably like you've seen in forest photography. And if you've seen Alabama Hills, it's just piles of rocks and blue sky, and it can be hard to come up with a composition. But as I was towards the end of this Hidden Valley trail, we were up at some height and hiked down some steps, and my eyes were drawn to this composition, and I knew I'd wanted to come back maybe during sunset or possibly even during the night to get a night shot of this. And this composition was just tucked away in the back of my head. Well, in 2022, I finally went out to capture the Milky Way over this shot. So I used a app called Planet, and Planet is wonderful if you like astro or moon shots or just knowing when sunrise, sunset, moonrise, moonset are. This is a fantastic tool. So by using this app, you can pre-visualize the placement of the Milky Way core from this location. And from that, I was able to get an idea of when to go out here and capture it. So I drove out one Saturday evening, got to the spot before sundown, and then took many shots and worked on the composition to make it the most pleasing to me. And so I was framing it up, taking test shots. This was all handheld to quickly try and figure out what composition I was going to like the most. And after reviewing the images, I came up with this composition. So this final image is a blend from a blue light hour shot. So I have low noise and plenty of detail in the shadows. And then I blended with the sky a star-tracked shot of the Milky Way. But while I was there, I set up my camera to take many shots over and over using an adapter called an intervalometer. And with that, you can basically just control, it's like a remote control for your camera to just create an exposure, wait some time, create a new exposure, wait some time, create a new exposure until you have, an hour's worth of shots. And when you do that, that gives you a reference of where the Milky Way was in the night, and you can create cool animations. And this night we had a little bit of clouds and some hikers hiking through here, and so you can see their lights on the rocks, and you can see the Milky Way drift by in the evening. And here is that animation I made. So in the parking lot, I got a star tracker out, which lets you align with the North Pole, and then it moves with the rotation of the Earth. And what this means is when you mount your camera to the star tracker, the stars are still, and that allows you to take long exposures, improving the signal to noise ratio. And so you get really fantastic images of the Milky Way without a lot of post-processing effort. So I took at least 10 images of a minute each and then aligned those and stacked them in Photoshop. And so using the Blue Hour shot I took from on the trail and the Milky Way Star Tracked guided shots, I blended it together to create this image. Next set of photos I want to talk about is a trip I made last March to Death Valley National Park. So I used this Planet app to make a prediction of when the moon was going to set over Mount Whitney. I really like the mountains at Mount Whitney, so I thought this composition would look great. By chance, I also checked out Zabriskie's Point in Death Valley to see if the moon would align with that. Sure enough, it turned out when the moon was setting over Mount Whitney, it was rising over Zabriskie's Point in Death Valley. So I came up with a ridiculously ambitious plan of driving to Death Valley to get moonrise over Zabriskie's Point, and then driving to Mount Whitney, sleep, and then get up before the moon set to photograph the moon set over Mount Whitney. I was trying to maximize my photography productivity of these two events. And this was a total failure. So I drove out to Death Valley and hiked the I think it's Golden Valley, to photograph the moonrise over Zabriskie's Point. However, it was too dark. It was near sunset, but it was too late after sunset, and here's the image that I got. Obviously, there was no light in the foreground because it was too late after sunset, and then the moon was too bright, and so you cannot get a single exposure getting the detail of the moon and the foreground. So this was a total failure. So while in Death Valley, I felt sad and dejected at my total failure in my poor planning. And so that, I opened up the Planet app, and yeah, I concluded that the moon set over Mount Whitney would be the same situation. Like the moon set too early, and the sun would not come up, and the mountains would not be lit up. So you'd get this strong silhouette, and it wouldn't be good. So feeling like I totally failed, I thought I was just going to abandon that plan. I didn't feel like driving that night from Death Valley out to Mount Whitney and possibly freeze my butt off sleeping in my van. So instead, I decided to spend the night in Death Valley and get up before sunrise and hike through the sand dunes at Mesquite Sand Dunes in Death Valley. And I was sure glad I did. So I had a really wonderful morning hiking out into the dunes. I got up, about an hour before sunrise, so I was wearing a headlamp and hiking out into the dunes. It was frigidly cold, but it was beautiful. I was the only one out there. You get incredibly soft light before the sun rises, and I was hunting for interesting shapes and shadows and compositions, and this was one of the better piles of sand I shot that morning. Also, I really love trees. Trees are one of my favorite subjects, but in Death Valley, in these sand dunes, there's some kind of bushy thing that grows in the sand dunes. So these aren't trees, but these are wooden branches. And again, before sunrise in this soft light, this looked incredible. So here's that image. Also, I was looking for moonset, and while I was in the dunes, the moon was setting over the desert, and the timing was wonderful, and you had these pink skies before sunrise and the bright moon setting over the dunes. I got a couple of shots I was happy with of the moon over the dunes. And finally, the sun started to peek up over the horizon, and if you've seen any dune photography, it's always about these abstract shapes and light and shadow, and so I was on the hunt to find a composition that was pleasing of the light interacting with the dune, creating some interesting shadows, and I was lucky and got this shot. Okay, the next image isn't technically from 2022, but it was darn close. It was Christmas Day 2021, and there was a comet out there that was almost naked eye visible, but not quite. So I could have shot this from anywhere. I found kind of a dark-ish location from where I live and drove out there, and it wasn't the greatest conditions. It was very windy. So I parked my vehicle and set my Star Trekker on the leeward side of my vehicle. That means out of the wind as much as I could. And then with I think it was I think I had my 70 to 200 with a 2x teleconverter on. So I was probably at 400 millimeter, pointing it at the comet, and luckily I was able to find it and track it, and then I took mini shots and stacked them in Photoshop to produce this image of the Christmas comet 2021. As you can see, we can see many of the separate little jets of ionized gas and dust blowing off the comet and the green coma. I was very happy with that image. And finally, the best landscape photo I produced or published in 2022 was from a trip that I took like 5 years ago to Mono Lake. Just like forest photography and Joshua Tree National Park, Mono Lake is a lake, but it has these interesting salt formations called tuffas, and they're very abstract piles of rock, and they don't lend themselves to beautiful images and compositions unless you've had a lot of time there and have figured out what to photograph. So this, I believe, was from 2017, but I never edited it or published it until this year. And I didn't realize what I had because, earlier in your photography career, you might take images, but, the raw file coming out of the camera is very flat and dull. And so I didn't know what I had, and I didn't know how to process it to get the most out of it. And so fast forward 5 years later, in 2022, I spent some time and watched some photography editing tutorials and was able to produce this image. This exposure was an experiment of taking some long shutter speed to like smooth out the lake water. And there was some wind, and so you can see that the wind was making the water kind of choppy, and you can see some white foam in this shot, but the light did kick off and we got some pretty pink skies, and I was able to get this long exposure, and with the edit, this is possibly the best landscape photo that I've published so far. So there you have it. There's a review of my best photographs that I published in 2022. Thanks for watching.